So hi, everybody. My name is Leah Sanchez, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'm the head of programs and outreach at the Textile Museum of Canada. Along with our partner organization, the Art Gallery of Gulph, I'd like to welcome you all to our program this evening. I'm speaking to you from my home in Toronto, and which is also where the Textile Museum of Canada is located and operates from. Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work here and through our activities seek to create a space for people to share, learn, and celebrate the textile practices of today and long ago in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So tonight we are going to be hearing from Chase artist Jagdeep Raina, whose exhibition is currently on view at the Textile Museum of Canada, and its curator, Shauna McCabe of the Art Gallery of Gulph. Please feel free to put in your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A, and there will be time to address these at the end of the program. I would now like to introduce our presenters whom I've had the pleasure of working with throughout the installation of the exhibition at the museum. Jagdeep Raina was born and raised in Guelph, Ontario. He has an interdisciplinary practice that spans drawing, textiles, writing, and more recently, video animation, film, and ceramics. Jagdeep received his MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. He has been the subject of solo exhibitions at Christ Bench in Los Angeles, Cooper Cole Gallery in Toronto, Midway Contemporary in Minneapolis, and the Art Gallery of Gulph. His work has been included in exhibitions at the National Gallery of Canada, the Risty Museum of Art, and the Rubin Museum of Art in New York. Jagdeep is a 2019 recipient of the Textile Museum of Canada's Melissa Levin Emerging Artist Award and the 2020 recipient of the Sobey Art Award in Canada. Shauna McCabe is a curator, arts administrator, and educator based in Guelph, Ontario, where she is the executive director of the Art Gallery of Gulph and adjunct professor at the University of Gulph. Shauna has also held positions as the director of the Textile Museum of Canada in Toronto, director of the Rooms Provincial Art Gallery in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and senior curator of the Confederation Center Art Gallery in Prince Edward Island. With a doctorate focused on contemporary art history, landscape aesthetics, and social practice from the University of British Columbia, she has curated over 50 exhibitions of Canadian and international artists, including most recently Sites of Memory in 2020, The Drive in 2019, Jagdeep Raina Chase in 2019, and Matthew Moore Fieldwork in 2018. So without further ado, I would like to turn you over to Shauna and Jagdeep. Welcome.
Thank you, Leah. It's so wonderful to be here and to see so many familiar names in the attendees list. So hello, everyone. Welcome. I just want to start with a land acknowledgement as well, as Jag and I are both based in Gulph, which is a treaty land that's steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. And as we gather tonight, we acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Gulph resides on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples, who are the ancestral holders and today the treaty holders of this land. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land and offer our respect to our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships with them. We express our gratitude and recognize our responsibility for the stewardship of this land on which we live, work, and create. So thanks again for joining us. As Leah said, do put questions in the chat and we'll deal with them towards the end. I know that well, this is going to be very much a dialogue. I'm just going to start by introducing kind of Jagdeep's practice a little bit, but then we're going to move into a discussion looking at the works that are in Chase, that is installed currently at the Textile Museum of Canada, but also some of the work that informed earlier iterations of Chase, because it has evolved over 3 venues. So I wanted to start with these images because they actually are from my first studio visit with Jagdeep. And I wanted to start here just to give you a sense of some of the key aspects of his approach to his artwork. One dimension is the element of telling stories. So each artwork that you see in the sort of the work that he has in front of him here is part of the arc of ideas and issues that he's consistently working on. And I would see all of his work as sort of one body, even though they have different sort of groupings and thematics within them. And they are less pristine objects than documents that are part of this trajectory of research questions that he's pursuing. Here you can see, this also gives you a sense of the breadth of his practice. He is focused on telling stories of South Asian diasporic histories through drawing and textiles, and sometimes combining those 2 elements as well, as you'll see, to document the histories and geographies of pioneering Kashmiri and Punjabi Sikh communities in the South Asian diaspora. And a substantial element of this work engages archival materials and oral histories. This is actually during one of the tours that Jagdeep did of the exhibition here at the Art Gallery of Gulph. I'm going to get confused actually about where I am. This is from the Art Gallery of Gulph, and sort of bringing this new work in to sort of be part of the conversation that was around the work that was already currently up. And as well, these are from a couple of programs that were presented in association with the exhibition and as it evolves. So the top image on the right is actually from the program that Jagdeep curated for the Art Gallery of Gulph, and the one below is from the program he curated for the Peel Art Museum and Gallery in Brampton. So, and I know there's one coming up at the Textile Museum as well. So I think too, one of the things to just keep in mind is Jagdeep is always thinking and considering histories, but these conversations actually become part of the dialogue around these histories. And so this interest in archives, and then also kind of contributing to those archives and transforming them is a consistent part of his work. So perhaps we can just start with that idea of the archive and the archival impulse that's in your work, Jagdeep. This was actually a quote from an interview you did some time ago, just talking about where these archives are when you're talking about a marginalized community, a diasporic community. And so just, recognizing that, these are kind of written, not necessarily kind of formal written histories, but might be informal materials, things like VHS tapes and records and cassettes and oral history manuscripts, yellow photographs. So, online databases and things you actually have to go and find. And I know that this is actually a work, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is from Rhode Island School of Design when you were doing your Master's of Art there. And I was in your studio, I believe, but the Fletcher Archive Library. So I think maybe you want to talk about this and we can move into some of the other archival projects you've worked on. Oh, you need to unmute. There you go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so this is a work I did, and first of all, thank you, Leah and Shauna, and the Textile Museum for hosting this conversation. It's always so nice to be in conversation with Shauna, and it's been really great to kind of work with you on this and watch the show kind of evolve and grow over the last couple of years. So I'm really happy to do this. Yeah, I mean, this work kind of encapsulates, it's almost become kind of its own time capsule in a sense, because it's a record and document of a very specific time of my kind of trajectory as making work around this type of history. And I mean, this particular work kind of documented my studio space at the time, which the room was kind of two cubicles that had like a wall divider, and I had both cubicles to myself in my second year as a student doing my MFA. And so the first room, the room at the back near the window, I had was like my studio space where like I would make my work. And then the first room I kind of did this almost like a kind of a performative project where I transformed it into like a physical library. So I had like carpets, I put like a bookshelf, and I called it kind of like an archive library, and like I taped the walls with just all kinds of stuff like newspaper clippings and quotes and like old posters and photographs and kind of clips from manuscripts. And it was kind of like my archive library. And it was cool. Like when I would do studio visits, people would kind of linger and stare and be like, whoa, it's kind of strange to see the space kind of inhabiting kind of like both this kind of like performative library, but also kind of a physical studio space. And one of my professors was like, why don't you draw your studio, make it work, make a drawing of this space that kind of is capturing kind of a transient moment of your time as like this historian. And I was like, that's a great idea. And so that work comes from there, and it kind of plants a lot of the seeds of my practice, which is always thinking about historical memory and thinking about historical memory through kind of a research-based methodology of making work and what that looks like.
Mhm. So, and I know this series of work came, I know you were working with like photographic collections, right? So.
Yeah. Again, also from grad school, this work on paper is about 6 or 7 years old now. And I feel like it also kind of roots my practice in a very specific moment in history. And this drawing in particular was kind of my early explorations into thinking about, like what does kind of a record of a community look like in the West, and how a community might have kind of built themselves, not through just the way that they looked or the type of lives that they led, but through the physical kind of historical monuments that they or structures that kind of they might have inhabited. And so that was what this work was exploring.
Mhm. And this is a different building, right? And this work was in the exhibition that was installed there as the first floor became the Sikh Heritage Museum. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that was so this actual work on paper is quite huge. It's almost like 10 feet. It's very long. It's like 3 sheets of like 4 by 5 feet that I then put together to kind of make into a diptych. And so the show in BC at the Sikh Heritage Museum was actually kind of it wasn't the actual work because the space is a heritage building. So they kind of did like reproductions of the work and framed them and hung the work like in a frame. And it was a really great way to like think about memorializing an art practice without having the artwork physically be there, but like another kind of translation of the work. And so that was a really wonderful experience as well, to kind of have an image of this work be presented in like a heritage museum space that was connected to these histories.
Mhm. And these structures also reappear. Like I'll actually will show this in another image from another perspective in a few minutes. But here's one actually. So also I think it's important for people to understand how you actually revisit the same image and the same content in different formats, right?
Yeah, so this is one of the first ever tapestries that I embroidered in 2018. It's almost 4 years ago now, which is kind of crazy to think. And yeah, it was thinking a lot about kind of the subject matter of these histories and what it would look like translated into another medium. And so textiles was always a kind of a natural progression for me. I was always really interested in sewing and embroidery, and with the Melissa Levin Award, I was taking some weaving workshops, and it's definitely a skill set that I just find so kind of compelling, both because of its materiality, but also like any other medium, it has a rich history. And so the translation of taking a work on paper and then giving myself kind of like a formal assignment of what it would look like as like a textile produced this piece.
Mm-hmm. and that dynamic between the drawing and the textile continues and evolves, as we'll see. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so this is the work on paper. And so, and just, I guess, to give people a sense of kind of the spectrum of different histories that you're looking at. They're all connected because they're all connected in you. But maybe you want to talk about this series of work.
Yeah, so this series of work was thinking a lot about a residency I did in London, England in 2016. And it was a really particular moment in history because I was doing the residency right after I'd finished grad school, and I was in London during a strange time when Brexit had just happened. And so the city was kind of grieving. And I felt like London still felt very open and very much it didn't feel kind of enclosed in the way perhaps maybe kind of other parts of the UK perhaps felt like. And so it was an interesting time to be in the UK, and it made me think a lot about kind of looking at my work in a more, expanding the way that I looked at my work. And so one thing that I was doing was I was having conversations with, people who were creating like in the 80s and early 90s. I was doing a lot of research around kind of British nightlife and British club culture, and specifically thinking a lot about like how club culture in the UK was kind of going through kind of a really dramatic shift with the ways in which Afro-Caribbean and South Asian communities were kind of coming in and kind of reclaiming these spaces into their own. And so one phenomenon of music that I was studying was called Bhangra, which was like a form of Punjabi folks mixed with reggae and hip hop. And it was created by working class migrants and who were working in the factories of Britain. And then I was really inspired by how this music during a really specific time was kind of the beating heart of the UK. And it was happening during the time when like London and the UK seemed to be heading into a direction that was where nationalism was fading away, because it was post-Thatcher. And so like 1989, 1990, and obviously the 90s in the UK were a time where everything felt so much more open, and like it was kind of going away from kind of this looking inward. And of course, being there when Brexit had happened, the people who had organized these, spaces of parties and protests and like, club culture and like DIY culture were all kind of shocked by what had just happened, because they were like, no, all of a sudden, 23 years ago, the UK feels so much more futuristic in a time when we thought that nationalism had ended, and now we're back to the beginning. And so maybe start thinking a lot about time being cyclical, and maybe wonder about like how these histories could be explored again, because as we all know, it doesn't reflect a period of time that's fixed, but makes you realize that time is constantly kind of inhabiting kind of like a spiral. It just keeps going in circles and circles. And so this work came out of that thinking.
Which one of the things that you mentioned are sort of the spaces associated with these cultures that evolve, and that's actually partially what sort of really I found interesting in your work. These ideas of these spaces that are even in some ways they're soft geographies, so they're kind of focused on community and in many ways like more concrete than concrete buildings, right? So, and how they grow and they change. And so the first iteration of Chase had more drawings, and a lot of those drawings had to do with these sites that were, as you say here, sort of, they continue to be elevated to the same prominence as places like the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, and Central Park, but without any of their permanence. Which is, I think what happens when, in that interplay of memory and migration, and how these geographies are mapped onto everyday landscapes in new lands, right? In new terrain. So, so we've got these sort of like these transnational geographies that evolve. And this one, that was sort of a focal point in our exhibition called Friday Nights and the Punjabi Grocery Deli in New York City. and these are just, many different kind of takes on and different kind of perspectives on the Punjabi Deli, the exterior, but then also the interior and the people and the families that are associated with these places. Maybe too, I know like if people are not familiar with your work, like the titles for each artwork is pretty significant as well, and they're so poetic. And maybe you just want to talk about like this particular series and how you named them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll see if I have a copy of the journal here. There's a copy of a journal that I had worked on around. Okay, I don't think it's on my bookshelf at the moment. But anyways, so I had thought a lot about. I wrote an article in grad school. I took a creative writing seminar about the history of the Punjabi Deli, and it was a great experience because I went there and I interviewed the owner's son, who was the same age as me, and his dad had opened up the space in the early 90s, and he was a taxi driver in New York, and like that. It was like a largely working class South Asian community in Queens that Govinder, the owner's son, he had kind of come out of that history and saved up his money, opened up the deli in New York City in the early 90s at a time when the East Village was also very different from what it's like now. It was much more affordable, and the neighborhood was also quite, it hadn't kind of gone the kind of the beautification project that other parts of New York City had. And so that was a really interesting experience to interview him and to learn about this space. And I wrote an article for it and made some work around it. And writing is something naturally that that I always feel like is a part of my practice anyway. Like it's, and even going back to undergrad, I did in addition to doing a BFA, I did a major in English literature. And I always wrote all throughout grad school, and even now over the course of the pandemic, over the last 2-3 years, I've been taking kind of intensive writing classes. And so writing has always been something that I see not so much kind of as separate from my visual art practice, but something that I is a skill set I always want to keep pushing and developing. And so naturally, the titles were also kind of gave me the freedom to develop that skill set and use language as a way to kind of create titles that can then be read as like literary and like think a lot about like literature in these titles.
Mm-hmm. I love how each title actually captures the personality of the character.
Yeah.
So and then these are Gulph. So because this exhibition originated in Gulph, where you're from, a lot of the kind of the buildings and physical spaces that are depicted are Gulph locations. And again, this was one of your first tapestries, I think, as well, right?
Yeah, also one of the early ones. I remember, Shauna, I think you were hanging out in the studio when this one was being made, and I remember that conversation. Again, one of the first ones I did, and once more kind of took that, like I feel like these early ones were almost studies in a way, like they were kind of me getting comfortable with thread and like a hoop and a needle and sewing and thinking about how to translate my works on paper into a textile. And yeah, the Gulph work, similar to the kind of the Deli, I think it's rooted in a very specific history of kind of a community that's kind of figuring out how to kind of grow and like kind of establish themselves. It came from that kind of capturing that time, and I think a lot about these migrations from the 60s and 70s, specifically in Ontario, and what that was looking like. And how communities from the global south were coming, and the types of the ways in which they were kind of creating kind of spaces within like geographical locations. And so like the Punjabi Deli being like a kind of a disused rundown bodega in the early 90s that was turned into like this kind of place for home. And then the kind of the Sikh temple in Gulph that used to be a beer store in the 70s and 80s, and then the community turned it into like a beer store. So thinking a lot about what you said about that term, soft geographies.
And it becomes a bit of a map too. We've only got a few of the images in here, but if you even look at Jagdeep's website, you'll see many more kind of elements of this social geography. And then part of it becomes a commentary too on the options that are available, right, to the community. And so, which as we sort of move along in these images, we'll sort of get to sort of the work that you're doing now that kind of engage a different kind of politics. But do you want to talk about this work?
Sure. Yeah, this one is also done in 2019. Yeah, I think thinking a lot about, again, I think the title was very literary, and I don't really know what to say about this work anymore. Like I feel like it's yeah, thinking a lot about subverting architecture, subverting history, thinking a lot about, I think I was thinking a lot about, like, what exploitative working conditions were like for like kind of immigrants in the 70s and 80s, and how a lot of them are being employed into factories, and kind of just like that early grasp of what life was like for that specific time, and how I think in many ways people who worked kind of labor jobs, who were immigrants, kind of just, even if the working conditions weren't, they didn't enjoy it, they still did it. And so I wanted to kind of think a lot about critiquing that. Yeah, critiquing that.
Mm-hmm. So, and I, the spaces sort of span those, the factories to homes. And this is actually the work that inspired the title of the exhibition, Chase. And I know this is actually also related to this idea of scarcity mindset. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think, any community, any kind of historical, thinking a lot about history, one eventually realize that, history isn't something that's homogenous, rather is like a group of people, or stories of migration, like any, whatever you're kind of exploring as an artist, whatever historical subject matter you're interested in, there will come a point when you realize that, viewing your interests has to kind of be done in a way that that isn't kind of romanticized, or there has to be room for nuance. And so I think that was eventually something I was thinking about too, like what happens when a community does build home in a new place, or stories around diasporic histories, and what does that look like? What does it look like when a community who is racialized, for example, comes to a place, but then we're also settlers, right? Like, so what does that say? Or even within like a group, there's divides on class or caste, or or religion, or sexuality or gender, and so that idea of like this scarcity mindset started coming from that, and that was also inspired by my time living in the UK, because I think what the UK did was it really kind of shifted how I thought a lot about history. And one of the people I turned to was Stuart Hall, and his writings. He has this quote that says, no identity survive a diasporic process intact or unchanged. They don't maintain their connections with their past undisturbed. And that really helped, because I realized, my time in London made me critically reflect on the diversity found within any community, and to really seriously consider different types of hierarchy that play out, whether it is through class, gender, caste, sexuality, religion, region, and all of that stuff is constantly has to be considered, for sure.
I think too, what is important here too is you're actually creating the archive of this space, right? This community in Gulph, in particular, in this set of images. And I know this was associated with a gas station that was built, and gas station grind. Yeah. So we had a series of these large black and white drawings in the exhibition.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
I think there's still one possibly in the Textile Museum exhibition as well.
There's one at the garden, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. and a series of, a lot of this is around community, right? And spaces associated with community.
Yeah.
And so I just put in a series here that are very kind of, I think this, you're speaking about community, but then also about personal spaces. So my mother's Punjabi rug. So these sort of turn to more personal experiences, I think. So you're covering sort of like the sort of whole span, this arc of experience, personal to more community and collective spaces. And the gardens. So I think this series in particular, the garden is a recurring element for you, and we'll sort of see how that shifts in the contemporary work too. But these this idea of these gardens bringing this tradition to a new context and rebuilding it here. So sometimes you went from the drawing to the textile, and in some cases from the textile to the drawing. So, and also in each exhibition, there is, Jagdeep has commissioned and will involve someone to write a creative text basically for the installation. And do you want to talk about this one, Jagdeep?
Yeah, so when the show first opened up at the AGG, the person on the right, Akhil Kumarasamy, is a writer who's based between New Jersey and upstate New York, and we did a residency together. The residency was 10 artists and 10 writers, and so she was a writing fellow, and we became friends, and we've stayed in touch. And so when the show opened up, I asked her, I was like, no, Keel, like there's a small space that's available at the museum. Would you like to write like a 200-word text, wall text for it? And she said yes. And she also came down to the opening. It was really nice. And so I'm holding a copy of her book, Half Gods, which was published a couple of years ago. It's actually right here. It's a really beautiful book. It's a collection of short stories, and so you can see it here. And her new book is coming out next year. It's her first novel. These are just her short stories, but it was just like a fun way for me to think about collaboration, like within the context of like a solo show and what that could look like. And because I love writing so much, and I love the relationship that my work has and continues to try to develop with writing. It gave me just such a wonderful opportunity to commission Akhil to write a wall text.
Mm-hmm. And these become part of that conversation about the work. They're not really directly talking about the work, but kind of prompting new thoughts and ideas and questions about the work. Yeah. So then I think for the Textile Museum exhibition, we've been thinking about, because as Jagdeep said, this exhibition has evolved over 4 years. So it has been changed in each context, and kind of in response to what is occurring at that moment, what Jagdeep, you're thinking about as well. In the spring, we actually did, Jagdeep curated a film screening for the Art Gallery of Gulph called Azadi Intertwined. And which is looking at kind of the protests and marches. Well, it involved 2 documentary screenings that were looking at protests and marches of Punjabi farmers, as well as resistances to the erosion of Kashmir's political, economic, cultural, and judicial autonomy. And Azadi means freedom. And then this became also the title for an artwork, kind of a new approach to artwork. So maybe you want to talk about sort of your shift to this content and these ideas, and also sort of what you're doing with the series of work in terms of materials.
Yeah, so this work was also my first attempt at quilt making, and so Faith Ringgold is somebody whose work I love, and she's known for taking paintings and instead of stretching them on a canvas, she sews them into a quilt. And so that methodology was really inspiring to me because it kind of it pulls out like my love for textiles. And so when I made these 2 works, both exploring specific moments and and the histories of farm workers, right? Specifically women farm workers. I took the two works on paper, both specific different times. And so the one on the right was of immigrant farm workers in the 70s and 80s fighting for the right to get unionized, and the kind of the psychological cost of experiencing physical and psychological abuse as farm workers, wage theft, and so leading the movement to get unionized. And so there was a documentary that was done in that time period by Anand Patwardhan, which was looking at BC's farm workers. And so I spent time with the pilot of the film, and we were writing back and forth, and I was able to get a small macro grant to work on the archives that he has for that film that he made. And then so the work on paper came from that still, and the other one came from another archive of another friend of mine who's been documenting the Green Revolution in India, which is like it's an agricultural framework that was introduced to India in the 1960s, US-sponsored agricultural framework that was based on high yield seed varieties and intensive irrigation and drainage, and forcing farmers to use chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and how this has damaged the landscape of Punjab because of declining water tables and soil erosion and low forest cover, and finally like an epidemic of farmer suicide. And so the photograph that I was working with from that archive was Punjabi women who have now become farmers because of their partners who have passed away by suicide. And so they're working in the fields, and that history is from the 2000s. This history is from the 1970s. So like, what would this look like if I put these two together, and then make it into a quilt? And so I sewed a quilt. The bottom I did a embroidery called pulkari, which is a embroidered textile from India, from Punjab, and then also associated with histories of labor, and like histories of community, and then at the top I did an embroidery of different Indian birds, specifically birds in Punjab that are going extinct because of the effects of the Green Revolution. And then on the side, that little black circle are actually like a series of bugs that I embroidered called the mealy bug, which is a type of pesticide that has become like the opposite of the bug has like gone the opposite route of being extinct. It's like grown so much in proliferation because they grow from they come alive because of the pests and the chemical fertilizer. So they eat the crops and they damage the fruits and the vegetables, and they're just a pest. They damage the land. And so what would this piece look like that compresses all of these histories? And formally, I feel like a quilt could work. So when I did all the hand embroidery, I then took all this fabric and I sewed it into like a quilt, and like a diptych quilt.
Mm-hmm. And these are sort of, almost very drawing, sort of combining the sort of textile and drawing.
Yeah.
And I think your work is always evolving, and that's what's so interesting, is sort of see with each sort of shift in idea, how that plays out in terms of the materials and approaches to it. So these are also dealing with the same content, chemical fields.
Mm-hmm.
And these were created, these were created for the Textile Museum exhibition in advance of that. Yeah.
Yeah, all this work was done in early 2021, making these quilts. And I mean, I did have the Textile Museum at the back of my mind, and naturally I just wanted to make more of this like kind of drawing quilts and see what would happen.
Mm-hmm. Keep using there. Chemical cotton flowers.
Some of them sometimes have like poems that are written at the bottom.
Oh yeah, maybe talk about that, because there's a number of those here.
Yeah, just once again, kind of thinking about that interest I have with writing, and especially after coming out of the last 2 years, with so much time taking writing workshops, I felt like it kind of got me back to my roots of like the love I had doing an English major, and thinking about writing not as like its own insert thing that like I'm trying to do like when I can, but instead of actually actively putting it as a part of my practice and devoting a lot more time with it. So So I've been embroidering short poems into some of my tapestries, or even making pieces for other exhibitions where it's just like a full poem that's been embroidered, or like a large piece of text. And so this one was called "Please Strip Them of These Chemical Cotton Flowers and Let Them Cling to Peace." And I just saw a question pop up that I'll just quickly answer. So the documentary filmmaker's name was Anand Patwardhan, and I'll type his name in the chat and I'll send it off. Yeah, similar as well. There's poetry written in that one too.
Mhm. So you've already given the context for the birds.
The birds, yeah.
And I actually, some of the, as you're talking about the poems and in some of the earlier drawings that we showed, there's actually, the title of the artwork is actually part of the artwork as well. It's like a kind of precursor to how you're working with poetry in the work now. Kashmiri shawls. So I think as we're sort of in the next kind of works we're looking at, what I wanted to sort of point to too is how textiles themselves become a focus for you, and how you're, not only sort of your material, but then the politics of production, right? The politics of textile production and the histories, because that's so it's so central to every single work. I think from this point on, and then I'm going to show this, for example, and pashmina goat, which is actually on view at the Textile Museum, as are the Kashmiri shawls. And this was actually first presented this series was presented at the Peel Art Museum in early 2020, just before the pandemic started. So do you want to talk about this series?
Yeah, and so these are 3 shawls I wove throughout 2020 and 2021 with the help of the Melissa Levin grant, and weaving is something that I want to continue pushing myself in. But I was also interested in the history of the Kashmiri shawl as being kind of a material remnant of like a violent imperialist, with kind of a violent imperialist past. And so, there's been a lot of imperial fascination with the Kashmiri shawl, which has, whether it's been by the French or by the Sikh Empire in the 18th century, the Afghan Empire, like many European shawl agents, like many people were always interested in the Kashmiri shawl. And so there's always a lot of exploitation that happened towards Kashmiri weavers, not getting, making like barely anything, and like, horrible conditions of working, and the Franco-Russian War that happened in 1872, which where a lot of shawl agents shifted their markets to other regions without kind of a care to what would happen to the people who were already, the artists that were already making, like, employed to make the work. And so Kashmiri weavers have like hundreds of them died of starvation in the 17 and 1800s. And obviously now there's Kashmir is one of the most, it's one of the most beautiful regions in the world, but it's also the largest, most militarized zone in the world as well. And so it's an undisputed territory. And so, I was thinking a lot about, the current history of the Kashmiri shawl production, which is, the severe winters that, because of climate change now, where thousands of pashmina goats are dying, which is driving up the price of the wool, or the low pay that's being given to Kashmiri weavers, which is driving away interest in the craft, or even the market now that's being flooded with cheap machine-made domestic substitutes as a result of globalization. And so I was thinking about all these histories. And so what I did was I embroidered hand embroidered these 3 fragments of Kashmiri embroidery that I was drawing from by studying like antique Kashmiri shawls, including one I have in my home. And then I collaged them into the shawl that I wove. And then if you lift them up, you can see a photograph that's underneath. And the photographs came from a collaboration I did with my cousin, Nanaki, who's a physician. She's a family doctor of Kashmiri descent. She's practicing in Toronto. And she's always kind of combining family medicine with human rights. And I think a few years ago, she went to Kashmir and she documented like just how militarized the landscape has become, particularly the villages of Kanihama and Baramulla, which is, where our family's from and where the Kashmiri shawl comes from too. And so I used, I took, she sent me her photographs and I sewed them in, and then the Kashmiri embroidered, embroidery almost kind of acts as like a flower where the person can like lift it and see the photograph underneath. So that was kind of the research behind that piece, and also inspired by Emily Jasir, who's a Palestinian artist, and she made a piece called 418 Palestinian Villages Deployed, Destroyed, and Occupied, where she sewed a large piece of fabric to resemble a refugee tent, and she embroidered 418 Palestinian village names into it. And I remember seeing that work and being like, oh my God, like, and the piece was installed at the Guggenheim Museum, and I was like, this is really beautiful to see the simple act of embroidery and textiles have so much kind of really emotional and intense like political meaning. And so that work also inspired these shawls.
And this one also talks about production.
Yeah, so another shawl that I worked on weaving, and then took some silk embroidered thread that I got from when I was doing my residency in Pakistan in 2019, and then I embroidered a pashmina goat on it.
And this is the commissioned text for the Textile Museum of Canada exhibition by Kathy Gray and Kim Anderson. Just let people read that for a second. It kind of focuses on the textile component.
Yeah, Kim Anderson is a professor at the University of Gulph in the Department of Family Relations, and she's interested in Indigenous gender and families and well-being and urban Indigenous peoples. And she came to my show back in 2019, and I was always interested in her work because I've read a bunch of her books that she edited. I think I have them on my shelf. So she edited this one, which I read back in, I think a couple years ago. It's called Keat Sahanak, Oral Armisting and Murdered Indigenous Sisters, and she edited this, and this was really beautiful. And I love the cover of the beadwork that was done on it. And I remember we met up, and I was telling her about my research and like being interested in kind of like histories of imperialism in Kashmir and like why racialized communities come to the global north, and like what happens when they come here as like people of color, but then they kind of inhabit this place of being settlers and being kind of complicit in and not kind of taking full responsibility for that. So we had this really beautiful, really nuanced conversation about the complications between Indigenous communities and communities of color who have come to Canada as a result of like imperialism and like what that looks like. And so that's a conversation we've been having just kind of really intimately and really casually too. It's just been really beautiful to talk to her. And then when I got the show decided to move on once more to the Textile Museum, I just emailed her and I was like, Kim, I'm just inspired by the research you've done. Would you like to write something? And she was like, I would be honored. And I also I love how you're asking me to do this as a part of a collaboration. So I want to make it collaborative as well. So I'll talk to my friend Kathy. So her and Kathy wrote something. So it's kind of like this like chain of collaborative interventions, which is just really lovely.
Yeah, and so more references to textiles and textile
There's
making.
another little tapestry I did of a Kashmiri weaver at his loom, and then at the bottom is a Kashmiri embroidery called umbi or inzozmi. And umbi means used to be translated as the tree of life.
So sort of takes us into the sort of one of the second to final sections, but the work, your most recent work is looking sort of more at relationships and intimacy. Do you want to talk about that kind of shift in focus?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just very natural. I think thinking a lot about I feel like so much of my work deals with history in such a kind of a global way that it's nice to also kind of look at like scenes of intimacy and like moments of slowing down and I think something I've just been thinking a lot about was I went to VTAPE a couple of years, 3 years ago, and I watched kind of their documentaries around like film and video that they have about looking at the relationship between kind of you know caste and class and sexuality with kind of being from like approaching that with a lens that is not Eurocentric. And so I was thinking a lot about that and thinking a lot about caste and queerness and and intimacy and desire and just all of those and what that would look like and how that could be added into this exhibition. So I think Chase, like Chase for me, because it plays with that idea of dismantling homogeneity, one of the ways in which I wanted to think about that for this part of the show was dismantling the homogeneity around intimacy, around desire, and around gender. And so that's kind of where this kind of work came from. It's kind of a soft exploration of that. And so I just also saw this great comment about Felix Gonzalez Torres. Yeah, I mean, he was one of the first artists he's one of my favorite artists of all time. And obviously the piece, The Two Lovers of the Clocks. And on one hand, he was making work where he was being like he got banned for from several different countries for making work around colonialism and specifically he was kind of critiquing what was happening in the ongoing policies of Israel against Palestine. And so he made a painting of that, and then he would also make works around like intimacy and desire, and he's also an activist. He was he passed away by AIDS, his partner passed away by AIDS, and I was really inspired by like him as somebody who approaches kind of themes of like desire in a way that still feels very, on one hand, very intimate, and on the other hand, very political. And so he is somebody who's just really made me think like that. And so I feel like when we love our favorite artists, we try to emulate them sometimes, whether we know it or not. And so I just wanted to do an ode to The Two Lovers by embroidering the two clocks of the two figures that are kind of intimately embracing.
It's interesting too how that intimacy shifts from the earlier work. So the earlier work is focused on family and community. Very sort of like close view of that from your perspective to this kind of a different form of intimacy. And this is the final couple of images, and this is probably sort of the most recent kind of development in your work, Jagdeep, and that's to sort of think about projecting on textiles and making film, right? So creating narratives, and both of these are very layered pieces, and maybe you want to talk about those just to give people a bit of context, and hopefully they can see these in person at the installations in person at the Textile Museum.
Yeah, so animations is something that just naturally felt kind of the next step that I wanted to kind of take the time to build a skill set in. And so, William Kentridge is somebody who I've loved. Kara Walker, her shift from drawings into animations has also been something that her animated films are so beautiful. And both of those artists, deal with animation in a very in a very kind of in a way in which the hand is very present. And so they draw every single film still, take hundreds of photographs. It's all stop motion, and that process of really slowing down and using drawing as a way to make an animated film without kind of relying too much on technology was something that was very seductive to me, because it allowed me to make kind of the animations really tactile and like really physical. And so I made these two animated films not really with the intention of submitting them to Chase, but I just wanted to make them just to kind of push myself and explore that part of my practice. And so the first one I made was called O Lahore, which is like a short little animated film I made inspired by my time in Pakistan. And you know, the film kind of looks at visiting the ancient Kashmiri Gate in Lahore, and like, you know, going there with a video camera, documenting the gate, and then talking about how the gate has become kind of mythic because it's one of the only gates where you could walk right through and you would end up right in Kashmir. And I had kind of realized when I got there that if I literally went into a straight line right through this gate, I would have ended up at my grandfather's village, which was, you know, it was now in Pakistan because of, you know, India's being kind of decolonized from Britain and how that led to kind of all these borders being drawn. And so that was a really, really intense experience. And then I came back and I had all this footage and I wrote this poem and I did a bunch of writing workshops and I got the poem edited and I just made it into an animated film. And I invited a friend of mine to narrate it and another friend who's a sound designer to make the music, put it together. And then I started sharing it with people and people responded really well. And you know, it just, yeah, it's got screened at the Yale University Center for British Art, and it was picked up at the Los Angeles International Film Festival this year. So it was like really cool. And then I was like, I want to present this at the Textile Museum. And one of the ways in which I can incorporate textiles is by taking a Kashmiri shawl and projecting onto it. And I did the similar thing with this film too, Mother's Fulkati, which is about yeah, once again, like a little poem, a poem that I wrote, and then the poem tells a story about a woman now living in Gulph whose great grandmother, when their family was forced to leave Pakistan, one of the only things that they carried with them was this old fulkati, this ancient textile. And you know, her grandmother's passed away. Obviously, her great grandmother passed away. Her mother is now in her 80s now, and so one of the only things she has of like this past, not even in India, but even before India, of when India wasn't even divided, is this old textile. And so she's a professor at the University of Gulph, Mother Anand. And so I went to her house and I saw the textile and I was so inspired and like just really, I ended up writing this poem and then worked on it with a writing workshop editor. And then again, did the same thing, wrote a series of animations for it, made a series of animations for it. Invited a friend to narrate it, invited my cousin Paul, he's a sound designer, I invited him to do the sound. And then we just made the film. And then, yeah, like Shauna, you encouraged me to start submitting it to film festivals, and I got it into the Los Angeles International Film Festival, which is really exciting. And then that was so great. And then I was like, I want to present this and once more with institutions too. So I approached the Textile Museum and I was like, no, I have this film that's literally about a textile and how the type of violence that is imprinted onto a textile and how a textile is forced to become displaced. And it just made sense to screen it here. And then because I have an old fulkati at home, I was like, I want to project it onto a fulkati too. So both of those films are currently on display at the museum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the films are quite powerful, and I think the combination of the kind of the textiles from your own collection and the interplay is quite wonderful. And I mean, one thing I will say about all of your work, Jagdeep, is that there is this consistency. I think this was so great, just seeing how this exhibition has evolved over these years with new additions and new concerns and new questions. And this, what you said, sort of this constant innovation. So, and you can all see from these images that there's no preciousness about the material. It's I think, you know, you're always looking at, you know, what will work to tell the story you want to tell at that moment, and finding the tools and teaching yourself, right? And it's very inspirational, actually. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shauna.
Yeah. And I know if there are further questions, just throw them into the chat and we can deal with those. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and for this conversation tonight. It's been really lovely to see you, at least at a distance, the familiar names that are in the list. It's great to see you all.
Thanks, everybody. I don't think there's any more questions, so I think, yeah.
Welcome,
cool.
Susan. And yes, the exhibition is on till March 19th. Yes, there is an event there as well, an event next month. So I guess that's January.
Yes.
Yes.
So,
Oh yeah. Yeah. So next in January we're doing an event about which is going to be a film screening. It's going to be once more. I've invited three artists, three friends of mine who have an artistic practice that are all quite interdisciplinary. One of them is a writer, Amrit. He just came out with his first book, which is on my shelf somewhere. I think it's here. Here it is. So he's a writer. He wrote this really beautiful book called Keep Moving On, the migration of a Punjabi Sikh family. And he's also a rapper and also works in all kinds of stuff. He's a teacher, he's a writer, he's just like really an artist and just an really amazing person. So I've invited him to like do a reading on whatever he would like based on like this book, or whether he would like to do it on something that he would just like to read, inspired by the exhibition. And the other friend of mine is Sumit Judge, who's a lawyer working in Toronto, but is also really creative, and he made this really beautiful film called Vishal, which is about kind of the precarious working conditions of international students from India currently living in Canada. And that's a topic that that's really been kind of, I think, really been heavily kind of on my mind. And his film is so beautiful, and I invited him to screen it and to present it at the museum. And then the third friend of mine is Selena Dillon, who is also really inspiring. She's a musician and a writer, a songwriter, and an artist. And so she's going to create and share some music for the event. And her and Amrit they actually worked on an EP together of a collection of short songs like 3-4 years ago, and they had invited me to do the album cover, artwork cover for it. And so this is kind of a fun way to kind of include them into the programming. And it's just my way of just kind of having this really fun responsibility of taking kind of a solo opportunity at a museum and making it collaborative. So please come out if you can. I think the museum will be sharing information about it soon, and it's free. It's on Zoom. So January 14th.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Thanks everybody.
thank
Bye.
you so much, Jagdeep and Shauna. Thank you, everybody.